Britain will fail to meet its target for reducing greenhouse gases by a long way. That was Tony Blair's admission this morning, but he insists Britain will still meet legal agreements on climate change.
Well, this is what the government had wanted to do. They're basing their figures on the level of carbon dioxide emissions back in 1990. They said by 2010 they'd cut emissions by 20%, but that is not going to happen. The latest figures show they have already fallen by about 7%, but by 2010 they'll only achieve a 14% fall in emissions rather than 20% as they hoped. Here's Andrew Marr.
Global warming is, by definition, global. Floods, melting ice caps, sweltering summers. But the political response begins at home. Tony Blair wanted Britain to be a world leader in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. But today, bad news. The government admitted it was on course to miss its key target, a cut of the emissions by 20% in 6 years' time.
How does he really expect the British public to have faith in his declared ambition to lead the industrialised world, including President Bush, in actually tackling the climate change issue successfully?
Mr. Blair said Britain was one of the few countries which would meet its international promises.
It is true we set an even tougher target for ourselves on CO2 emissions. At the moment, instead of a 20% reduction, we will achieve a 14% reduction. However, we have years to go before we have to achieve that target.
That's true, but campaigners on global warming say the real position now is even worse.
Since they've been in power in 1997, this government hasn't actually delivered any emission reductions at all, despite having quite a comprehensive climate change programme. So clearly something's not working.
This might look like an averagely busy urban street, but a few years ago it was a great deal busier than this. And what's changed things has been the London congestion charge. Exactly the kind of rather aggressive interventionist politics that campaigners on climate change say is needed much more widely to apply to all of our cars, to businesses, to power stations. But what kind of politics is that? Well, for one thing, risky.
I think most people are now caught up with the idea that this could be a big problem for our children or our grandchildren. Actually, if we're not to have even more dangerous climate change than we anticipate, we've got to try and get global emissions to turn down.
Meanwhile, the opposite is happening, and the vast majority of scientists agree there is too much hot air. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
So are the critics right to condemn the government for failing to meet the carbon emissions target? Or is it partly down to all of us consuming too much energy in the home? Our environment correspondent, Roger Harabin, spent the day with one family in Leicestershire.
It's just after 6 o'clock. This house may be in darkness, but its carbon emissions have already begun. The central heating boiler has started its daily contribution to climate change.
Now the carbon's really flying. Electricity looks clean, but it's mostly produced by gas or coal that churn out carbon dioxide. Patrick and Teresa Foster are concerned about climate change. They have energy saver bulbs all round the house. But even they've given in to the fuel-hungry dishwasher. It's proving harder to cut energy from homes than ministers thought. Transport's an even bigger problem. Patrick lives just south of Leicester, but he works in Coventry.
It's a 25 miles journey each way, so it's 50 miles a day, 250 miles a week, which is quite horrendous really when you start to analyse it.
Patrick's car does 50 to the gallon. Cars are getting more efficient nowadays, but most of us are simply buying bigger ones and driving them farther. Carbon emissions from transport are going up, not down. Patrick's office presents another difficulty. We're using more and more computers, and as climate change sets in, air conditioning creates pollution all year round. Back at home, the kids are gathering more troubles. We're all buying more and more gadgets that churn out carbon, not just when they're used, but also when they're made and transported. It's changing the climate for the next generation.
I try not to worry, because worrying doesn't solve problems. I think actions are better than just to worry. I think positive actions are what people need to do.
we were doing about.
By the time the children have kids of their own, the government hopes to have cut carbon emissions by nearly 2/3 to help stop climate change creating chaos. Today's report shows how very difficult that target will be. Roger Harrabin, BBC News, Leicester.